Hello and welcome to today's lesson on distance and midpoint. This is going to cover topics in standard 5.1 in geometry, and then it's also going to begin to cover questions in the study island lesson distant, midpoint, and slope. This is part one of two parts that cover all of those topics in standards. So this topic just covers distance and midpoint, whereas part two is going to cover slope. So you want to make sure you watch both of them if you're working in study island. So as you're working through here, just remember you can always pause and rewind so you can keep up with taking notes, and then you can also pause at the beginning of a question so that you can work a problem out and then watch how the problem is actually worked out so you can get a gauge of how well you're understanding or if you need more practice. So I'm so glad that you're here, and let's go ahead and look at our distance notes. So here is the distance formula. The distance formula says d equals the square root of x sub 2 minus x sub 1, that quantity squared, and then you add that to the y coordinates, y sub 2 minus y sub 1, that quantity squared. So don't let all those subscripts, don't let them trip you up. Because all it's saying is that you need to be consistent, just like the slope formula you used last year and other formulas. So whatever x coordinate you use, you have to use that y coordinate from the same point. You have to use them both at the beginning, and then you have to be consistent with the ones you use at the end. So that's basically what you need to keep straight. And what this is calculating is you have 2 points in a coordinate plane. It's calculating the distance between those 2 points if you draw a straight line between them. So this first example is asking us to find the distance between 3, 6 and negative 3, 3. So it's just to help you visualize what this looks like. I've gone ahead and added a coordinate plane to this question, and I'm plotting those 2 points. And so what you're finding is the distance, so how long that line is I just drew between those 2 points. So I also went ahead and copied down the distance formula. Remember, you're subtracting the x's, squaring those, subtracting the y's, squaring those, and then adding those, and then taking the square root. I didn't write the subscripts down. You can. Some people find them confusing. Some people are fine with them. So I just left them off this time around. And another thing that I find it really helps is if we label the x and y coordinates of the 2 points. So we have, remember, x and y, it's always alphabetical order in a coordinate point. So the first thing you're going to do is subtract those 2 x's. So I'm going to do 3 minus a negative 3. And then because I pulled positive 3 first, I'm going to have to pull 6 first because they were both in that same coordinate. Remember, you have to be consistent. And then I'm going to subtract my y's, which is 6 minus 3, that quantity squared. So you can do 3 minus a negative 3 in your calculator. That's fine too. Or you can know that if you subtract a negative, that's the same as adding. So this is going to be 6 squared plus, and then 6 minus 3 is 3, so 3 squared. Then my next step is to square those 2 numbers, so 6 squared is 36, and then 3 squared is 9. And then I take 36 plus 9, which is the square root of 45. Now, if you have a TI 30XS, you can put the square root of 45 in there, press enter, and it'll simplify it for you, and you'll have your answer. If you don't have that, then you're going to have to break this down on your own. So I have the square root of 45. I'm going to think, what perfect squares divide into 45? 4, no. 9, yes. So this is going to break down into the square root of 9 and the square root of 5. The square root of 9 is 3. And the square root of 5 doesn't break down anymore. So this is going to be 3 square root of 5 for my final answer, which is A. This second question is asking the same thing. What is the distance between these 2 points in a coordinate plane? So the first thing I'm going to do is label those 2 points X and Y so that I can keep everything straight. And then I've already written down my formula, so I'm just going to go ahead and substitute into that formula. So I'm going to take X minus X, so that means I'm going to take 6 minus a negative 18 plus, and then I'm going to subtract my Y's. So my Y coordinates here are 2 and negative 8, so I'm going to take 2 minus a negative 8. And then both of those quantities are squared. So just remember that if you pull 6 first in the X subtraction, you have to pull that 2 first in the Y subtraction. Whichever coordinate you're starting with first with X, you have to start with Y. You have to be consistent. So my first step is to do that subtraction. So I can do 6 minus negative 18, and that's going to be the same as just 6 plus 18. If you have a hard time remembering your negative rules, though, you can use a calculator to check yourself. 6 plus 18 is 24. And then I do the same with negative minus a negative here. That's the same as 2 plus 8, which is 10. Then I square those numbers. 24 squared is 576. 10 squared is 100. Then my last step is to add those numbers and see if I can simplify. So 576 plus 100 is 676. The square root of 676 is 26. So that means they are a distance of 26 units apart, and that is my answer. Now we're going to look at problems that deal with the midpoint formula. So what the midpoint formula is you have these 2 points on a coordinate plane, and you're finding out what point is in the middle. And to do that, you're going to calculate first, you'll calculate the x coordinates of that midpoint, which would you add the x's and divide by 2. And then a separate problem, you're going to calculate the y coordinates by adding them and divide by 2. So really what you're doing is you're taking the average of the x coordinates for your x answer, and then you're taking the average of the y coordinates for your y answer. And so what I've done again is I've added an x coordinate plane for you to see what it is that you're calculating. So they give us these 2 points, -3, -1, and then 3, -5 also. And so what I'm doing is I have this segment drawn between those 2 lines, and what you're doing is you're trying to find the exact midpoint of those between those 2 points. And so what I would recommend that you do is you get graph paper on the EOI, and if you don't, ask for it. Graph those 2 points and then see if your answer makes sense. And sometimes if you totally blank, you can take these answers and see which one of these actually makes sense to be the midpoint without actually having to calculate anything. I'm going to show you how to calculate it though. So I went ahead and copied down the midpoint formula, and then I'm also going to go up here and label my coordinates x and y so that I can keep track which ones are x numbers and which ones are y numbers. Because one of the common mistakes is getting those mixed up. So first, when I calculate the x coordinate of my midpoint, I'm going to add the x's. So I'm going to add -3 plus 3 and then divide that by 2. -3 plus 3 is 0 over 2, which is 0. And then I'm going to do the same with the y's. I'm going to go ahead and add my y coordinates. So -1 plus -5 over 2. -1 plus -5 is -6. And if you ever get caught up in your negative rules, adding and subtracting those integers, use a calculator to check yourself. There's no shame in that. And then -6 divided by 2 is -3. So that means when I put this all together, I have an x coordinate for 0 and a y coordinate of -3 for my midpoint, which says that my answer should be C. Let's go ahead and check that. And if I look, 0, -3, if I could draw a straighter line on this, would definitely be my midpoint. That answer makes sense, so C is my answer for number 3. This question says point T is located at 3, 1, and point U is located at 15, -11. And they want us to go ahead and find the midpoint. So this time I'm just going to calculate it, but like I said, I would always, on the EOI or on a test, grab a piece of graph paper, plot out these points, and see if your answer makes sense. There's no point in getting it wrong. And so remember, you're going to add your x's and divide that by 2. And then you're going to add your y's and divide that by 2. So, and then I'm going to go ahead and label my x and y coordinates so I don't get those confused, because like I said, that's a big mistake that lots of students make, is they just get cross-eyed and mix them up. So label them so it doesn't happen. And then I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'm going to go ahead and add my x's. So my x numbers here are 3 and 15. So 3 plus 15 divided by 2. I add first. 3 plus 15 is 18. Divided by 2 is 9. And then I go ahead and do that with my y's also. My y numbers here are 1 and -11. Divide that by 2. 1 plus a -11 is -10. -10 divided by 2 is -5. So my midpoint here is 9, -5, letter B. Another type of midpoint problem you could see is where they give us an endpoint, the midpoint, and ask us for another endpoint. So this is another instance where I would grab a piece of graph paper and plot those points to make sure those answers make sense. So here, I'm going to go by a scale of 2, meaning that each of these lines here represents 2 instead of 1. So if I'm going to graph the point 4, 1, that's going to be right here. And then if I'm going to graph the point 9, -2, that's going to be right here. And this is my endpoint, and this is my midpoint. So I'm looking for some endpoint over here that makes this the exact middle. So the way that we would solve for that, and like I said, you could plot these points to see which one makes sense, and maybe that'll narrow it down to just one for you. But I want to show you how you would algebraically work that out. So first we're going to solve for that x endpoint. So I went ahead and wrote down my midpoint formula, and then I'm also going to go up here and label my x and y numbers. So I know that one of my endpoints is going to be 4. So I'm going to have a 4 plus that x that I'm looking for over 2. And that's going to equal the midpoint, because this is my midpoint formula. But I only need to use my x coordinate of the midpoint because I'm working with x's right now. So I'm going to go ahead and solve this. So to do that, I'm going to just put this 9 over 1 and then cross multiply. So, or you could multiply 2 by both sides. Both ways work. So here, 1 times 4 plus x, that just keeps it the same. So it's 4 plus x equals 18. And then I subtract 4 from both sides. And these cancel out. And I'm left with x equals 14. So the x coordinate of my midpoint, or my other endpoint, is going to be 14. Well, the only one that has that is C, but I want to go ahead and check my y to make sure that I didn't make a mistake with my x's. So I'm going to use my y part of the midpoint. I have a y coordinate of 1, so I'm going to substitute that in. So I'm going to have 1 plus y over 2 equals the y midpoint coordinate, which is -2. So once again, you can put that over 1, or you could multiply both sides by 2. Here the 2's cancel, and I'm left with 1 plus y equals, and then negative 2 times 2 is negative 4. Subtract 1 from both sides. These cancel, and y equals negative 5, which is the y coordinate here. So last check is to make sure that that endpoint actually makes sense, and I'm going to go ahead and plot it. And it does. It makes that M look like a midpoint. So C is my answer. Here's another example. It's the same thing. They give me a midpoint, and then they give me an endpoint. And so I'm just going to show you how you would mathematically work that out. Like I said before, though, I would grab a piece of graph paper and make sure your answer makes sense when you're doing these problems. So I've written down my midpoint formula, and then I'm going to go and label my x and y numbers. So here, the endpoint is 12, 18. So that's going to give me an x coordinate of 12 for my endpoint, and then I'm solving for the other one. So I have a plus x over 2, and that's going to equal the x coordinate of my midpoint, which is 18. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to undo the divide by 2. Those cancel, and I'm left with 12 plus x. And then 18 times 2 is 36. Subtract both sides from 12. These 12s cancel, and I'm left with x equals 24 as my x coordinate. So if I'm looking, 24, the only one that has it as an x coordinate is D. So I'm going to hope that when I work out my y side, that works out to be 14. So the y coordinate of my endpoint is 18. So I'm going to fill that in, and then I'm going to add the y that I'm looking for, divide that by 2, and that's going to equal the y coordinate of my midpoint, which is 16. I'm going to go ahead and multiply both sides by 2. These 2's cancel, and I'm left with 18 plus y equals 32. Then I'm going to minus 18 from both sides. These 18's cancel, and I'm left with y equals 14. And that is going to give me that answer D that I was hoping for. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you learned something new.